Meanwhile, there remains as well much confusion about a phone call that the US President-elect Donald Trump is alleged to have had with the Russian President Vladimir Putin last Thursday. That's at least according to the reporting by the Washington Post. Now, it said that in that conversation, Trump had urged Putin not to inflame the situation in Ukraine. The Kremlin has since said there was no such phone call and that the whole story is fiction. Our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, is joining me here on set. Rob, enlighten us then, if you can, about this phone call.
You don't expect me to enlighten you.
Who knows?
Really, it is like that. The Washington Post, as you rightly said, reported this story. They must have got the story from somewhere. What the source was, not particularly clear at this stage, but it said that Donald Trump, in that conversation, had warned Vladimir Putin not to inflame the situation further in Ukraine and reminded him, apparently, that the United States has a very large military presence in Europe, hint, hint, and seemed to be trying to apply pressure on the Russians. The spokesperson for the Kremlin said this is absolute nonsense, pure fiction, to use his exact words. Where do you go from there? What can you draw from it? The big question, first of all, is, what is it that Donald Trump is trying to achieve? What is his policy going to be in Ukraine? And as so often with Donald Trump, there's a fog of confusion about where things are going. We get conflicting statements. His son, Donald Trump Jr., saying that Zelensky was about to lose his allowance from the United States, not helping matters very much. But the impression seems to be growing from various sources, including Mike Pompeo, who's former Secretary of State, not got a position in the current administration by all accounts. But he was suggesting that one thing that Donald Trump might do would be to try and increase the pressure on Russia in order to get a deal. In other words, he will say to the Ukrainians, you're not going to get Crimea, you're going to lose in Donbass, you probably won't be able to join NATO for 20 years, but we'll make sure we put plenty of pressure on the Russians as well, and you'll get an equitable deal. There may be something about that in it, and that could explain if there's any substance to this phone call story at all. That's what he was trying to do in that conversation. But frankly, we don't really know, Stuart.
No. Listening to what Gulliver was saying just a second ago from Kyiv, I mean, the fighting on the front line still very ferocious, isn't it?
No, it's forget about up in Kursk, but in the area around the town that Gulliver mentioned, Kurakhova and Pokrovsk, nearby there as well, the fighting is really at the most intense it has been since the start of the war in 2022. Admiral Tony Radakin, the chief of the defence staff of the British Armed Forces, saying that the Russians are taking absolutely colossal losses. On average, in October, 1,500 men a month killed and wounded. The total losses since the start of the war, over 700,000. That's more than 40 times than the Soviet Union lost in a decade of fighting in Afghanistan. And just yesterday, Russia apparently suffered the worst day of losses, close on 2,000 men in one day of fighting. But Russia has enormous human resources at its disposal that Ukraine lacks, and appears to be applying a strategy of intensive troop usage and prepared to take losses in order to sap the morale of the Ukrainians. They are taking losses, but almost inch by inch, they're making progress. Whether it's strategically significant progress at this stage, I suppose, is the moot point. In the course of the last month, they increased their gains by about 9 to 10 kilometers, according to the same Admiral Radakin. That's more than the Russians achieved in the whole of 2023. But is it enough to change the overall picture on the battlefield? Not really clear at this point.
And you talked about the morale of the Ukrainians there. I mean, are they having a decent effect from the Russian perspective on inflicting damage on that?
Yeah, they certainly are. You can imagine what it must be like being a Ukrainian soldier at the moment. A lot of the time you don't have sufficient ammunition, you don't have the weapons you want because the supplies are slow in coming in from Ukraine's Western allies. And at the same time as that, the Russians are attacking in these human wave formations that we were just talking about, which are enormously wearing on the Ukrainian defenders because they're cupping almost 24 hours. And so we are seeing a lot of desertion on the Ukrainian side, a lot of people away without leave. The number of desertions, apparently from January to September this year, according to a leaked document from the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, 18,196. And away without leave, absent without leave, 35,307. That's up twice on the previous year. So that gives a pretty clear picture of just how stretched the Ukrainians are and how that's impacting on their morale.
Rob, thanks very much. Rob Parsons, our Chief Foreign Editor here on France 24.